Hi, my name is Erin, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can reach a completed pen and ink drawing using these 8 simple pen and ink techniques. I'm going to start the video by showing you the techniques and then how I applied them to the drawing. Let's go! Here are all 8 of the techniques that I'll be showing you in the video. I'm just going to walk you through them one at a time. So I'm going to be using this Arteza fine tipped pen for these techniques, as well as some India ink and some Sharpies. Hatching is a technique where you place lines going in the exact same direction. You can change the direction that you place them in. You can go vertical, you can go horizontal, you can go diagonally, but they are all going in the same direction when you group them together. You can create value with hatching by placing the lines really close together to achieve a darker value, and if you place them further and further apart, the value appears lighter. So cross-hatching is the exact same thing as hatching. You start off with a series of lines all going in the same direction, but then you crisscross another set of lines going in the opposite direction. So I have some vertical lines here, and I'm going to cross over them with a series of horizontal lines. You can do this with lines that are vertical and horizontal. You can do this with lines that are diagonal. And similar to hatching, if you want to create value with your cross hatching, you can place the lines closer together to achieve a darker value and further apart to achieve a lighter value. You can also crisscross a series of lines going in all sorts of different directions. So with this example, I started with a diagonal. I'm going to cross over it with another diagonal going in the opposite direction. And then I'm going to also put vertical and horizontal lines over top. And the more that I layer lines crisscrossing over each other, the darker the value will be. So next up is cross contour, and this one you're basically following the shape that you've created rather than just doing straight lines. So on this cylinder I'll have to curve my lines to make it appear more three-dimensional and rounded. So I'm going to start off with some hatching, placing my lines closer together where I want it to appear darker and further apart where I want it to appear lighter. And then when I turn this into cross hatching, I'm going to curve my lines to match the curve of the cylinder so that it appears more rounded and three-dimensional. So scumbling is essentially just scribbling, but you can use this as a texture for moss or hair and many other things. But basically, if you place your scribbles more loosely and further apart, the value appears lighter. And if you really tightly pack in your scribbles and make them very dense, the value appears darker. So next up comes stippling, and you can use stippling for texture. You can also use it to create value or your lights and darks. This process can take a very long time, but if it's done well and you persist through it, you can create some very, very nice pen and ink drawings. Stippling is just creating dots, and the further apart you place your dots, the lighter the value appears. The more tightly packed in and more densely you apply the dots, the darker the value will appear. You can create shadows using this, and you can even create a very smooth value scale using stippling, where you just slowly build up the density towards the darkest area, and it will create some very smooth looking value. And I just wanted to show you this process in real time because it really does take a long time to build it up, just creating one dot at a time over and over and over again, but it is worth it if you really want to make a drawing using stippling. So next up is line weight, and this is just referring to the thickness of the lines. So I'm going to start off with this Arteza pen, and then I have a micron pen and a couple of Sharpies that just get thicker and thicker. And you can use this to create depth. You can use this to kind of pull the attention to a certain area over another. You can use this to create different values. Basically, the larger the mark is, the darker the value will appear. So I'm going to use this India ink to create some washes, and I have some water here. It's tinted green just so it showed up a little bit better on the video, but I'm going to use a brush, and I just like to lay down some water on my paper, and then I will dip my brush into my ink and spread it into the water that's on the paper. You can very easily create different values using washes by just taking a bit of ink and putting it into the water. It will be quite dark, but if you're very careful with the amount of ink that's on the brush, you can create very light values as well. I usually pick up a little bit of ink on my brush, and then I'll swish the brush out in my water just to get rid of any excess ink that's on it. I'll even dab it on some paper towel just to make sure. And then when I apply it into my water, I know that there's not very much ink on it, and I can create some lighter values too. And last up is just using a brush. You can do any of the techniques using a brush. I just find that it gives you a more organic look to the marks that are made. Now I want to show you how I use these techniques to create a drawing, and I'm just going to be drawing this piece of seaweed. I like to start out with a pencil sketch when I do pen and ink drawings. You can definitely just go in however you like, but I like a little bit of security, so I start off with a pencil sketch. Now I'm going in with a fine tipped pen just over top of my pencil sketch to refine it, and then once this was completely dry, I just erased the pencil sketch. Here's an example of how I used hatching and cross hatching in this drawing. I used it to create shadows and highlights, but I also changed the direction of the hatching that I'm doing based on the way that the seaweed is sort of bending and shifting around. In this clip, I'm playing around with line weight. I wanted to make some lines thicker where pieces of seaweed were overlapping each other just to create a little bit of depth, and also just to emphasize that there are two separate pieces of seaweed. Otherwise, it just looked a little bit flat. So here's an example of how I used cross contour in this drawing. The seaweed has these little air sac bubbles that are rounded. So instead of using straight lines, I curve my lines around that circle to make it look more three-dimensional and round instead of flat.
Well, my lawyer took me out to a fancy lunch to celebrate, and I'm still stuffed. How about that?
So I'm done using the pens, and now I'm going to use a brush and some liquid ink. I'm going to use this India ink, and I also have it in this burnt sienna color. I just mix them together to create a dark brown, and I'm going to play around with washes. So I like to mix my ink together and pour a bunch of water in with it because it's very, very saturated if you use it just right out of the bottle. And then I'm going to use this sort of watered down ink, kind of like how you would use watercolor, where I'm just going to apply a nice thin layer of it to my piece of paper and then allow it to dry before I add additional layers to make it darker and darker until I have the desired darkness that I want in the end. I sort of use this like also how you use watercolors, where you typically work from light to dark. So starting off with that very light wash, here I am just after it's dried, adding another layer of my wash. It's in that little cup with my two ink colors mixed together with a bunch of water mixed in. And I'm building up the layers. It takes a while. I ended up doing maybe 4 or 5 layers before I was happy with how dark the shadows were in the drawing. But in the end, it's worth all of the time and layering. Something that I like to do a lot while I'm working with washes, just to make sure that I don't have way too much water in the brush, is when I dip my brush into my little cup of my ink wash, I also tap it on a piece of paper towel just to get rid of any excess water that's within the bristles before I go on my paper. I like to paint or use the washes very meticulously and very detailed, so I like to make sure I don't have too much water on the brush so that it kind of goes exactly where I want it to go. But if you're going for a more loose painted effect, you don't have to worry about kind of tapping the excess water out of the brush.
husband's sick with Hodgkin's. She's in and out of the hospital with tumors, believing one thing has nothing to do with the other.
Because Pete told her about the chromium.
Well, get this, they had a seminar. They invited about 200 residents from the area, had it at the plant in this warehouse, telling them all about chromium-3 and how good it is for you, when all the time they're using chromium-6.
That document you found at the water board, the one that says about the bad chromium, you didn't happen to make a copy.
Of course I did.
I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you leave me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel to see the videos I do in the future. I hope these techniques come in handy for you, and I hope to see you next time.